Have you ever avoided talking about a subject or an issue because you didn't want to admit your bias or even appear to be biased to others? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so. To listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask more, better questions so that we might become more reachable as people. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. When I was a kid growing up in Kansas, I remember one of the major debates that raged across the state, and ultimately garnered national attention as well, was the state of Kansas's decision to remove teaching evolution from its standardized curriculum. I didn't pay much attention to the back and forth that took place across dinner tables and on the nightly news, but I remember feeling like it was such a strange thing to have the eyes of an entire country looking at you while you went to school. At least that's kind of what it felt like. Like just the act of going to school each morning was being watched by people waiting to pounce on what I didn't know or understand all that well. As an aside, these days, now that I've had time to reflect on the issue, I'm a Christian who believes faith and science are not mutually exclusive. They're not a binary choice. One of my favorite songs of all time, So Will I, 100 Billion Times by Hillsong United, has a verse that goes, "And as you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, evolving in pursuit of what you said. If it all reveals your nature, so will I." Okay, so getting us back on track. Time and time again in the history of the United States, children have found themselves under similar watchfulness as the adults around them argued and clashed over societal level issues. Again in Kansas, the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling in 1954 that deemed racial segregation in schools unconstitutional, that set off desegregation efforts across the country that placed children in the crosshairs of debates, arguments, biases, and even violence. We've seen it within the past few years as children were again swept up in adults bickering, to put it lightly, over COVID-19 restrictions and mask mandates in schools. And these are just a few examples of how these fights have affected children in school. My guest this week is Dr. Christia Spears Brown, author of the book Unraveling Bias: How Prejudice Has Shaped Children for Generations, and Why It's Time to Break the Cycle. Christia explores how biases passed down through generations and through systems have time and time again come to a breaking point with children standing at ground zero of the struggle. In reading Christia's book, I was struck by how often children are the rope in an ideological game of tug-of-war between warring and sparring adults. Christia writes in her book, "When we start trying to unravel bias, it becomes clear how often children are the collateral damage to adults' biases and biased policies." In our conversation, Christia and I discuss how vitally important it is that we as adults have real, honest, frank conversations about bias with children, so that they are not left to put the clues and pieces of the puzzle together themselves based on observing how their parents and other adults act. Recognizing and calling out bias takes guts, vulnerability, and even a little bit of audacity. As Christia notes, it'll require us to slow down our thinking and decision-making. But if it means future generations won't get swept up in more arguments and skirmishes, perhaps just maybe, it's worth it? Christia, you write in the book that children are often collateral damage when we try to unravel and deal with the topic of bias, in particular adult bias and systemic bias. Why is that? Why are children so often caught in the crosshairs of our attempts to tackle the issue of bias?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's because kids are both much smarter and much less advanced than we think that they are. So they're much smarter in that they're really attentive to really subtle things that adults are doing. So when adults are having conversations that don't even involve kids, they overhear them. If they hear something on the radio, if they hear something in passing, they really pay attention to that. And they form really elaborate ideas about what that kind of means. So adults can be having conversations and kids are extrapolating pieces of information, but because they're kind of limited and they're cognitively still developing, the things that they create out of those snippets and magazine covers and things that they see on a show are often much more influential and much more skewed and stereotypical and harmful than I think we realize. So we have adults that are, whether it be politicians talking or parents at the dinner table talking, kids are paying attention much more so than we realize and are both being harmed by the bias, but also developing their own stereotypes and prejudices very accidentally. But when we don't talk about it, we don't realize how entrenched those beliefs become.
So I've got a question based on what you just said, but I first want to tell you a little bit of a story here. Back when Brett Kavanaugh was being confirmed for the Supreme Court, Christine Ford came forward with her allegations of sexual impropriety. And I posted at the time on social media, I believe it was on Instagram, I said, please be careful in how you talk about this case and this situation in front of your children, in particular your daughters, and how you talk about Christine Ford, because there is a high likelihood that your daughters are going to experience or know someone who will experience what she is accusing this man of. Now, let's take the politics out of it, whether you believe Dr. Ford or not. I just said, be aware of how you talk about her, because down the road, your daughter's going to remember those words. And the backlash that I got, Christia, from that was unexpected and also very painful in that it was like, we do not want to talk about this. My daughter's going to be fine. She's a strong woman. I got that several times. Like, my daughter's going to be fine. And if this happens to her, she'll come to me. I was like, you don't know that. Why? So my question, Christia, is why is it so uncomfortable to talk about bias and what you just talked about, how we talk about others when they are not in the room?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think just unpacking some of that. I mean, I think you're posting that on social media was exactly the right answer, exactly the right thing, because we know by the time girls are around 20, 22 years old, about 1 in 4 have been the victim of a sexual assault. So 1 in 4 is an enormous rate. We know that about 90% of girls have experienced sexual harassment by the time they finish high school. And so it is really common, but we also know that they don't report it. So when that was happening, when she was, I mean, I had a similar reaction when she was testifying, thinking, this is so common. Now, granted, it's not normally in response to a Supreme Court, hearing, but the experience of being sexually assaulted by a boy who had alcohol involved, in which there were other peers also involved, is the most common way in which that happens. We also know that most girls do not report it because, one, they feel like they won't be believed, and two, they feel like people will be mad at them if they do it, which is, again, also that to that point of why should we be mindful of how we talk about her or someone in that situation, because girls are not reporting it because they're afraid people won't believe them. But we also know that there's so many consequences of being the victim of even just sexual harassment. It's associated with depression and anxiety and poor body image and really unhealthy behaviors towards the body, like self-harm and suicidal thoughts and problems in school. Like, the ramifications are profound, and yet girls aren't saying anything. They're not telling their friends, they're not telling their parents, they're not telling teachers because they don't want to rock the boat. And so I think it's, we don't talk about it. We definitely don't call it out as sexual harassment or sexual assault. We typically chalk it up to that's just kids being kids, or, that's locker room talk, or, oh, that's just boys being boys. As opposed to saying we should have a higher standard for how we treat each other, right? That we can expect more of people. And I think when it comes to other forms of bias, we typically assume kids don't mean harm. We assume that these things don't really matter. He was just joking. We see this with race types of biases too. Someone makes a comment and they say, oh, he was just joking. He didn't mean anything by it. But it has really profound consequences for the individual kid or teenager. And it is uncomfortable, I think, because to your direct question, I think one of the reasons it is so hard to have these conversations is we do like to think that childhood is a time of innocence, even adolescence. We want to think they're innocent. They don't think poorly about other people. They were just joking. They're just, trying to flirt, or they don't see color. Whatever it is, the form of bias we're talking about, we typically assume kids are immune to it. And if we bring it up with them, we will put this big neon, arrow on the problem, and it'll make kids biased. So if we call it racism, then we're going to make kids racist. If we call it sexual harassment, then we're going to make kids realize they're sexually interested in other people, right? It's this idea that if we talk about it, it will exacerbate the problem, when in fact it's the exact opposite. The only way to help reduce it is to actually start talking about it more.
So why is that? Why? I keep asking the why question, but why is that so uncomfortable to parents in particular? Obviously, I have two children. Obviously, I'm a parent, and this is of utmost importance to my wife and I to have these conversations. But why that sticking point, as you just described, of it's just the elephant in the room that I'm going to let fester there until when? Like when is the right time, air quotes?
Yeah. And the problem is, I think we put so much pressure on those conversations. So, if we think about gender and kind of sexual harassment and gendered bias, I think we think, oh, we have to have this conversation about consent and how we interact with other people in this kind of sexual context in a gendered way. And that feels like a really daunting conversation. If it's about race for white parents, we learn really early that talking about race is taboo, and white parents are really uncomfortable talking about it. And we think, oh, it's this one conversation. I have to sit down and teach my kid all of these forms of bias and how they're supposed to act and how people might act towards them. And so I think that's the big flaw, is that these aren't one-off conversations that you have to sit down and do it perfectly. It's that I think it's a lot less daunting and a lot more effective for these conversations to be kind of those micro conversations, the 1-minute conversation in the car when the kids are in the back seat and you're driving and no one has to make eye contact. So you can sometimes say a little bit more comfortably. Or when you're sitting there watching a TV show together, if something comes on, you pause it for a second, you have a 2-minute conversation, and then you continue watching the show. If you're reading a book together, something comes up. If you say something at the table, I think then it takes the pressure off of these having to be perfect conversations. And it allows us to make it part of the normal way in which we parent. Like, we don't think we're going to have let me teach my kids to be kind. So let me figure out the one time I sit down and talk about kindness, right? We don't do that when it comes to kindness, right? We just know this is part of how we parent. It gets integrated into our really daily parenting lives, whether it be they hit their sibling, or whether it be taking care of the pet, or whether it be holding the door open for an older person walking through. It's a constant conversation about kindness. And so we don't think about, do we have to do it perfectly? No, it's because it's if we mess up one day, we'll get it around the next day. So I think if we thought of bias more like that, it takes away a lot of the emotional pressure. And it says we don't have to be perfect. We just need to start helping kids recognize it, start battling our own biases, start the dialogue.
So right there, you talked about battling our own biases. And Christia, where I'm going to phrase it as fear, correct me if I'm wrong, but where does the fear of acknowledging our own biases come from? Why is that so hard for us to say, yep, I acknowledge that I have biases that I may not even be aware of? Why is that so hard? Why?
Yeah. Well, I think because it leads to a disconnect in how we think about ourselves. So I think that we want to be good people. I think everybody wants to be a good person. I'm sure that there are exceptions to that rule, but in general, we do. And in general, we want to be kind to people. And we really buy into the idea of everybody should be treated equally, particularly in America. It's really baked into at least the ideal of our country, if not the practice, at least the ideal of it. And the American dream, and that if you work hard, you can succeed. We all really buy into that everybody should be treated equally, and I'm a good person and I believe that. So you have that one concept of yourself. And then to acknowledge that you have biases, that we have ideas in our head that people aren't equal, and that some groups have a certain type of characteristics, and that we might treat people differently even accidentally. It's hard to reconcile that with this concept we like to think of ourselves as good and decent and fair. And so part of it is we just have to get more complex. We have to say, I can aspire to be a person who treats people equally, but that I have biases. And so to be that good person, I have to constantly be working on my biases. There's a lot of research that shows we almost all have implicit biases, those kind of unconscious biases. What separates us is those of us that acknowledge it and try to constantly fight against those biases and slow down our thinking and be deliberate and try to align what I say, our kind of hearts, which feel like people should be treated equally, and our heads, which have made these biased assumptions and connections because we live in a biased world. And so we just have to take the time and fight them, and that doesn't make us a bad person. It just means we've lived in a biased world for more than 10 minutes, and so we're going to have biases. And the challenge is to just constantly be working on it. I study this for a living, and I'm constantly working on it. I think that's the key, and to know that it doesn't make us bad and kind of evil people. It's just part of how we get better.
You touched on it a little bit there, but could you go into how we actually work on it? What can we do to be more aware of those biases and to actually bring those to the forefront and deal with them? What can we do?
Well, research has looked at this, so I'll say some evidence-based strategies that seem to work. Is one thing that's really important is to slow down our thinking. So we know that biases come out when we are kind of what we say under cognitive load, when you're trying to do, 14 things at once and you're busy and you're kind of stressed out and a lot of your thinking is on autopilot. That's when the biases are most likely to kind of be driving. And so we have to be mindful of what we're doing. And so that just means slowing down. So if we're having to make decisions that involve other people, make sure we're being slow and methodical and thoughtful. That allows our kind of conscious thoughts, are the parts that we're most proud of, to be in control, as opposed to those really automatic, kind of the reptilian brain part that just is really a connection of biased associations we've seen in our lives. We got to get the front part of our brain, the part that's we're in control of, to be the one driving, the car. So part of it is that. Part of it is, so some research suggests things like mindfulness, even if it's like 2 minutes in the morning of taking a moment to kind of be thoughtful and to think about your goal of being an unbiased person. So taking a minute or two in the morning to remind yourself of your goals of, I want to make sure I treat people equally and evaluate everyone as an individual. And just like be really present in that thought in the mornings seems to actually be effective at reducing implicit biases throughout the day. And so then a big part of it is just also learning about it and learning to recognize when it's happening. And the more we practice it, the easier it gets. So when we see a person walking down the street and we have kind of an automatic reaction, is really stopping in that moment and reflecting on the fact that the reaction was driven by a stereotype or a prejudice, and not on the actual situation, and rethinking how should I be thinking here, and kind of practice that reframing of what's really going on. And that practice seems to be effective.
Now, since your book was obviously talking about how bias shapes children, would it be appropriate then in those moments of reflection to, as you were mentioning earlier, just begin to have that conversation with our children? Would that be appropriate in those moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things I recommend, because I think it's a great idea, because it also tells kids that none of us are going to do this perfectly, because we know that kids are also going to mess up. And I think it's really important modeling to show kids that learning to be better is a lifelong process, right? We don't all, as the older I get, the more I realize, wow, we really don't ever get it all figured out, do we? And so it's helpful, I think, to teach kids kind of that growth mindset idea of it, that we're always working and that sometimes we'll mess up. And this is the process of it. And it's okay to be honest about that. And so I think modeling it for kids is a great way to talk about, I had a stereotype kind of at play, and that was what was driving that. But I'm going to rethink about this differently. How do you think we should do this differently? It also helps kids know that there's not a perfect way to do it, and that they can always be thinking about it. And helps them be critical of seeing a situation, thinking about their own behaviors, thinking how they could do it differently, and then trying to improve it the next time.
Now, something you briefly skimmed by in an earlier answer, but something that I also highlighted in the book was this notion that for so long our laws and our systems in this country have been shaped by this idea that because it's a common trait among people that is practiced, that they therefore cannot be regulated or bound by law. And I may be kind of butchering a little bit of the definition here, but basically the phrase that I remember, or that would probably come up, is, well, boys will be boys, right? Mm-hmm. It's just how boys act. So we're not going to try and prescribe a law or something to try and regulate that behavior. Where did that come from? Where did that idea or that belief come from, that common behavior cannot be regulated?
I mean, we've seen it since the beginning of American laws. I can say that. I mean, that was one of the things, I talk quite a bit in the book about, is, the same arguments they say for allowing sexual harassment in schools of, that's just boys being boys, it's not doing any harm, is really the exact same rationale that we saw in the 1800s that allowed racist behaviors and schools to be segregated by race. because we said, oh, this is just the way people are. We can't regulate people's racial attitudes. And so allowed the whole era of Jim Crow and separation of races, because the argument was we can't regulate people's attitudes. And if people don't want to interact with one another, then we can't regulate that. So we always seem to think that how people act, because if it's normative, is just the natural way that people interact. But what we know is all of our behavior is regulated, right? We regulate all sorts of behaviors. And just because we might think that it's common, it doesn't mean we shouldn't regulate. I think, I have 2 kids as well. And I think if it was left to them, they would eat ice cream and chocolate syrup for every meal. That is their natural predilection. But it doesn't mean I allow them to do that, because I know it's not good for them. And so I think things like sexual harassment are a similar thing. Yeah, just because it's common doesn't mean we should allow it. And in fact, it's not that hard for me to regulate my kids eating regular food for meals, right? It's just me saying, hey, you can't do that. I think it's just having an expectation. And just because our least common denominator, in our behavior seems to be common, doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And it's actually not that hard to change. We just have to say, yeah, this is not okay anymore. We have greater expectations for you than this.
Now, this may sound like a silly question, but are all biases bad or wrong?
Well, when we think about stereotypes, for example, which is, part of kind of the composition of biases, there are some stereotypes that are positive. So sometimes people will say, well, that stereotype or that bias is positive. So, Asian boys are really good at math, right? That's a positive stereotype. I would say, though, even though that sounds positive, it's actually wrong, because not all Asian boys are good at math. And therefore, the ones that aren't are not going to be getting the help that they need, and are going to be getting overlooked. So any stereotype is wrong, even if it's positive, because it assumes all of one group shares a certain characteristic. And that's not true for any group or any characteristic. There's just too much individual variation for those types of stereotypes to be true. So I think in that way, biases are always flawed, because humans are much too complex for them. Like, we all differ way too much. So yes, there may be kernels of truth in some of them, but it assumes people are a certain way. And we really have no knowledge of what that individual, who's much more complex than a bias, allows. And so I think in that way, they're always flawed. And then, I think our brain naturally develops biases because we see early biases developed in infancy. So we tend to think if we see something pop up when children are infants, then it's probably pretty ingrained. It's probably pretty innate. What the innate part seems to be is looking at people and putting them into categories and then learning information about those categories. Because that works really well for a lot of things. It works well for a dog. When I see a 4-legged furry thing with a wagging tail, I can assume it's going to bark. I'm assuming, if I mess with it, it might bite me. Like, having a certain amount of knowledge about categories is good. And so as humans who are, at the top of the food chain and we're very evolved, that's a useful skill to have. The problem is when we apply that same kind of mechanism to human beings are much more complicated than that. And so it's always going to be flawed when we use that really simplistic category-like thinking to actual people.
And you started to touch on it there, Christia, and I want to keep going down this path, because that was the point in the book where I was like, well, I've got this question. Is it necessarily wrong? Because there were studies of babies who preferred their race very early on, and obviously their parents, for the most part, are they're obviously interracial families, adoptive families, things like that. So even that answer has nuance, right? But my thinking was, well, of course, that makes sense. That bias towards someone who looks like them means that it's most likely their family or someone they know, and that bias is a positive thing. But where then does it begin to break down? Where's the breakdown where bias becomes, I not only just prefer the people who look like me, but I now think poorly of the people that don't? Where's the breakdown, Christia?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important distinction, is that we want kids to like the groups they're in, right? Like, we actually want that to a degree. Thinking your group is bad is not good for a positive sense of self. So we want kids to like their group. The problem does become when they start to think negatively about other groups. And that mostly becomes relevant in a world of finite resources. So when there are only 3 cookies, metaphorically speaking, to share, and you give all 3 to someone that looks like you and 0 to someone that doesn't, then we start to see what we call discrimination. And so then that bias of liking your group means you're preferring them with resources. And that's where it starts to be particularly problematic. A lot of the book talks about race and things like racism. And we talk about racism isn't just having biases, and it's not just having kind of prejudices where you favor one group or the other. It also involves prejudice plus power, right? So it's only when you have the 3 cookies and you can dole all 3 out to the person that looks like you, is when you really start to see these negative impacts of these biases, because you have the power to control how resources get distributed. And so I think that is a big distinction here of, we want you to feel good about your group. Some of us, if you have white kids, it gets a little bit trickier, because we want white kids to feel okay about being white, right? Because that's your race is your race. And so how can we help white kids feel positive about that, but also acknowledge the harm of bias and work towards fighting it in their daily lives, right? That's the only way that if you're in a group, and the same is true for boys, for example, when it comes to issues around sexual harassment and assault. We don't want boys to feel bad about it.
Bad about being a boy.
Bad about being a boy. Yeah. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
Yes. But it's like, okay, so a lot of people that look like you do these things. How can you be a better version of that? How can you help be a good ally or a good advocate? And so I think when we have kids that are in privileged groups, we also want them to feel good about it, but in a way that fights against bias as opposed to perpetuating bias.
Christia, I have explained it like this, and I would love your thoughts on if I'm going down the right path before. But you talked about power just now. I've explained it as, we all, I think, for the most part, believe the saying, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, I believe is how the phrase goes. In a world where you hold absolute power and believe that absolute power corrupts absolutely, wouldn't it stand to reason that someone who holds absolute power and is corrupted by it creates systems to keep that power for as long as humanly possible? And if that is a logical leap, then we can point to many instances where people in this country, let's just keep it in the United States, have held absolute power for many, many years. Wouldn't it stand to reason that when they held that absolute power, things were put in place to keep it? Am I on the right track there?
No, I mean, I think that that's completely true. And I think that's how we have such biased systems in place now. Is, for so long, our systems, using American laws, our systems were designed so that white men who owned land were the ones who made the laws. So white men that were wealthy, wrote all the laws. And so it's really easy then to imagine that what they're wanting to do is keep their power and keep their money. And so the laws are written to protect those things. And so then trying to change that status quo is really difficult. And so I think that's where we have to see changes. But, there's the great line of the systems work as they were designed to work. I mean, they were designed to condense power in certain groups. And I think then even when the people change, the systems are in place. And so, it's the idea of racism without racist. We can have really racist systems in place that have nothing to do with the individuals anymore, but they were put in place by individuals who were really focused on keeping the concentrations of wealth and power with people just like them. I think racism, for example, and sexism are about power. They're about power, I would say, more than anything else, and keeping resources in the hands of a select few and then keeping everyone else out. And so I think we cannot lose track of the role of power in this.
So I know I keep coming back to this then, but it's such a struggle for folks. We've seen it certainly in the last couple of years, the talk about the systemic racism that exists in this country. And you have a lot of pushback from people saying, I'm not racist. I work in this system. Therefore, the system cannot be racist. That is the logic that is used quite frequently. Why is that a fallacy? Or is that a fallacy? I'll ask it that way. Obviously, I have my opinions, but I'll ask you as the expert in bias and these things.
Well, I think that when you benefit from structural biases, you are part of the problem. I mean, I think that, I do think that concepts of privilege are hard because people often think, well, I'm not personally privileged. I've had lots of personal struggles. But the reality is if you're not the target of bias, then you are benefiting from it. There is that zero-sum game. You're either targeted by bias or you benefit by bias. No one is untouched by it. And so if you're not being targeted by it, you are benefiting from it. Hard stop. And that includes, again, there are limited resources. And so resources are going to someone. And they are typically going to still white, male, cisgendered, straight people of wealth. And that has not changed since the 1600s in the US. And so being part of the status quo is is benefiting from those systems, especially if you are those kind of privileged categories. And so I think that is uncomfortable for people to think about benefiting from systems. I think that individuals want to think they worked hard to get there, and they think, well, I worked hard to get here, and I don't have a lot of power in my job. But you're still part of a system that's meant to exclude others, and so we still have to figure out how to fight against that status quo. Most systems are biased because they were set up by people in positions of authority and was designed to keep people out. It's hard to find examples where that's not the case. And so, I work at a university, for example, and at a university, most faculty are white for the most part. Even on our university, for example, it's a land grant university. So I think the systems of oppression, a land grant university means land was taken from, well, they call it unoccupied land, but it was really occupied by indigenous populations. So Native American tribes lived there. The government took that land. So there's one form of oppression. Then the second way, they then divided it up so that 80% went to my university, which at that time was an all-white university, and 20% went to the university that was the historically Black college. So then you see a unequal distribution of wealth from the very beginning. And the school back then, 150 years ago, was segregated. So only white students were allowed to go to it. And so, of course, there's going to be entrenched biases at every point. And so, yes, I think as professors there, you don't feel like you have a lot of power, but you have benefited at every level from those bias systems. And so you have to question, well, why don't we have Native American students? Why don't we have a greater proportion of Black students? Why is the Black university down the street much less well-funded, right? These are all parts of the ways in which systemic biases get there by people long dead, right? Not by people that are currently there enacting bias policies, but still benefit from structures that were biased from the beginning. And so we have to figure out how can we make changes. And I think that example applies to lots of other types of jobs and schools and domains of life.
Do we have a language problem, Christia? Calling someone privileged, calling someone biased, is that setting the conversation up to be antagonistic, or do we just need to get over it and set our child ego aside and suck it up and say, yeah, I'm okay with these things? Where do we have a language problem, I guess, is my question.
That's a great way to think of it. I think we do have a language problem, but I think that I don't know of other words that would fix it. I think it's mostly we just have an attitude problem. I just think we don't like to think about ourselves as privileged. And so I think that's where the problem, we don't want to think about ourselves as biased. We want to think about ourselves as good people who work hard. If I went out and found 100 people and asked, how much do you agree with the statement? I'm a good person and I work really hard for what I have. I'm pretty certain most people would agree with that statement. And so then to say I'm biased seems to contradict I'm a good person. So we have a problem with that. And to say I work hard for what I have means we don't like the concept of privilege. And so I think it's really the idea that we don't like the idea that we might have benefited while other people suffered. And so it's really the concept that's the problem. It's not really the word. So the word is problematic, but I think ultimately we just have to be okay with, you might have individually worked hard for a lot of things, but you can also have been privileged in other ways, and both can be true at the same time. So
stop quibbling over the words and deal with the attitude. That's what I'm getting from you.
Yeah, you just got to deal with the attitude. And I think I can relate to it. So, my parents were very young when they had me. They barely graduated high school. I'm a first generation college student. We were very low income growing up. I navigated college. I navigated graduate school. I navigated being a professor. I feel very much like I'm not personally privileged. I've had lots of kind of traumas and things like that. But yet I'm a white cisgendered woman in the United States. I've got enormous ways of privilege, right? I don't walk through a store and get followed because people think I'm shoplifting, for example. People will give me the benefit of the doubt when I say something. When I go to a restaurant, people are going to serve me at a pretty reasonable time frame. I don't have to sit and wonder why people aren't serving me. Those are forms of privilege. And so even though I personally worked really hard, there's other things I don't have to navigate. I have 2 white kids. I don't worry about them being shot by a police officer, for example, because they're presumed to be criminals. That's a form of privilege right there. Not having that worry as a parent is a privilege. I worry about other things because they're girls in the U.S. But those are privileges that I have. And so it's okay to say I did work really, really hard. And I also have some privileges. And how can I use those privileges to better others? So if I have a seat at the table and people do give me the benefit of the doubt, how can I turn that privilege into action and not waste that privilege? I think that's the challenge.
Does our role as parents then become exposing our children to as much, I'll use the word diversity in all the different senses of the word? Is that the primary takeaway for parents, that our job is to expose our children to diversity of thought, diversity of skin color, just all these things that we've been talking about. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, I would say if I had to boil down advice to parents in 2 bullet points, long book, what do I think the 2 things? One is exposure to diversity, getting kids comfortable with people that are completely different from them in all ways. Because I think recognizing the diversity of humanity is really enriching, and it helps us generalize to people can be different than me, and that's really okay, and I'm comfortable with it. So getting comfortable with diversity, that also increases your knowledge of how people differ. And again, that's across gender identities, across sexuality, race, immigration, nationality. And then the other one is talk more about bias. So that kids can recognize it when they see it, help them be kind of detectives for bias. So for one, they're more comfortable with a variety of people that are really different than them, and they know bias when they see it. And that helps them be kind of inoculated from developing it themselves. It helps them stand up and stop it when they notice it happening to others. It helps in lots of ways, kind of the Saturday morning special, Knowledge is Power, from like the 70s and 80s. It's still, I think it is really true. Knowledge is power. And so diversity and talking about it explicitly, I think, are the 2 things that are the most important parts of what parents can do to help their kids.
Why don't we, in all the work and research that you've done, why don't we give kids the credit for being able to handle these conversations? You mentioned it earlier, but I want to come back to it. Why do we shy away from that?
I do think we don't give kids enough credit for being able to handle negative things. I think often also an important part of this is adults have so much kind of emotional baggage that comes with these ideas, right? We have this history of internalizing these taboo topics, or we know these kind of horror stories of things that have happened. And so we have all of this complex baggage that comes along with all of these topics. Kids don't. Kids look at people and they see differences. And the conversations about bias don't have to be as wrought as I think adults often think. Because for kids, they can be much more simple of, look at how much diversity there is in humanity. Like, here's a variety of gender identities, right? So gender identity is a classic one of, kids that are non-binary or transgender and then cisgender. Parents often think, oh, this is like too complicated. I can't talk about this kind of stuff with my kids. It's going to be too confusing. Well, if you say there's a boy on the street, you've already talked about gender identity, right? Like, it's really that simple. It doesn't have to be this big, traumatic conversation. You're already probably doing it. And for kids, they don't have all of that other baggage that adults are bringing to the table. When it comes to race, it doesn't mean you start with the 5-year-old talking about lynching, for example, but you can have other conversations that are developmentally appropriate that don't have all of the other emotional baggage that other conversations about race do. I wouldn't have a conversation about, police brutality with a 5-year-old, but I would talk about diversity of skin tone and how do we, have media that represents everybody, and why do some people look a certain way on TV shows and not another way on TV shows, right? There's lots of kind of age appropriate conversations so that as kids get older and more advanced in how they can understand society, those conversations can get a little bit more emotionally complex. But there's lots of really basic ways with young kids we can talk about it. But I think we often bring an adult mind to a 5-year-old conversation when it can just be a 5-year-old conversation about skin color and how hair comes in lots of different textures and how it's really cool that lots of different ways that people can look. Basic conversation. It gets more complicated as you get older. And that's the way it is for every conversation with kids.
It sure does. And I feel I would be remiss if we did not touch on the Florida Education Bill. Kids, as we have already discussed, kids in school have, your book is filled with examples of kids in school being in the crosshairs of these arguments. The bill itself removes from curriculum, not from discussion, from curriculum, the topics of gender identity and sexual orientation from being taught in school. I would be remiss if I did not ask you your thoughts on this. The parents, the proponents of the bill are saying parents should control these conversations. That is, kindergarten to third grade is too young to be having these conversations in curriculum. Of course, there are opponents of the bill that say it is bias, it is tamping down. Trying to think of the word here. It is. The topic, the bill has been labeled the "Don't Say Gay" bill, right? So I would be remiss to ask you, what are your thoughts as you look at this and the obviously polarizing effect that it has had in this moment in time?
Yeah, I think it makes me sad for kids, because what it teaches kids is that it's wrong to be something besides a cisgender boy or girl. And so what we know is there's a lot of kids that aren't that. So some data shows it's 1 in 8 kids identify as not in that kind of binary. So 1 in 8 kids are being taught by this bill that they are flawed or wrong or broken and damaged in some way. And that makes me really just sad for those kids. And then the reality too is gay people exist, whether we say it or not. And even in a kid language, what's frustrating to me too is it's not about having conversations about sex with a kindergartner. I mean, no one is doing that, but gay people exist, whether we talk about it or not. It's not the tooth fairy here. It doesn't matter whether we have conversations or not. That's there. And the reality is there's a lot of families headed by same-sex parents. And so now you have kids who are in a first grade classroom who have 2 moms or 2 dads, because we know that's increasingly common. And now they're being taught that their family is wrong or their family is damaged in some way. And I think when you tell a kid in the first grade that they are not okay exactly as they are, that is sad. And I think that does profound damage. And we know the stats about kids that are like trans kids, their risks of suicide is shockingly high. And so it's something, when they're in unsupportive families, it can be as high as almost 50% of kids attempt suicide. I mean, 50%. And so it's like, so we want to say that your life is not worth as much as a little bit of discomfort for this conversation. And so I just think that that's really sad and doesn't actually have kids' best interest at heart. I think these are not conversations about sexuality. It is the fact that there are LGBTQ people. That's one of the ways in which people come. And if you tell kids that this is bad to talk about, you're telling kids that either who they're going to be or who their parents are or who their loved ones are is wrong. And I think that that's never a message we want to give a kid.
I was researching the bill in anticipation of our conversation, and I did find someone point out it is not that the conversations can't be had in the classroom. It is that it cannot be part of the curriculum. And I want to pointedly ask you, Christia, should that be part of the curriculum, or, as you have many opponents or proponents of the bill, I should say, that it should be left to parents? As we've had these discussions over the last 50 minutes, where do you stand on that?
Well, I mean, I kind of think this is one of those things where they're trying to come up with a solution that didn't have a problem. I don't think any K through 3 curricula talks about gender identity or sexual orientation in the same way that K through 3 does not talk about critical race theory. These are not problems that were existing. These are solutions in search of a problem. And so I think that, honestly, no curricula. I don't know of one curricula that focuses on gender identity or sexual orientation. Where I think it pops up, like realistically, where, I mean, schools are doing their best to cover addition and reading. They're definitely not talking about gender identity. They're just not. They're too focused on trying to get their standardized test scores up because they're going to have money taken out of their school budget if they're not meeting benchmarks. That's a whole other conversation. But that's what they're doing. They're not even having time for a recess, and they eat lunch in 20 minutes. So they're not talking about gender identity. Where it might realistically come up is there might be a book in the reading corner. You know, all K through 2 classrooms, for the most part, have a little reading nook or something like that. There might be a book that's got a non-conforming kid, gender non-conforming kid in there. Or there might be a book that's got a picture of a same-sex parents in there. That might actually be happening. And my perspective is I hope that it does, because kids come from those families and kids need to know that to see their family represented. But I think that these nationwide attempts to get gender and sexuality out of young classrooms and conversations about race too. I think this fits the same issue of no one's having these conversations. They're not. I've been in thousands of elementary schools in a variety of cities. These things just don't happen. But I do think it scares people. And I think teachers are scared of it. And I think teachers are terrified of saying the wrong thing. And so I think what all these bills are also doing is putting a culture of fear for teachers, because they're afraid, if I am supportive of the kid, then it might violate this thing. And so I think teachers, it has a paralyzing effect. And I think that's a shame, because teachers have a hard enough time just trying to do the bare minimum of what they're doing. But to put all of these policies on what teachers can talk about and teach, I think we need to let teachers be the experts on what should be in curriculum and not politicians.
I can certainly agree with you on that point. So that is a wonderful place to leave it, Christia. Last question for you. Mm-hmm. What's a question that you wish you were asked more?
Oh, that's a good question. Gosh, I'm gonna stutter through it. I don't know. I mean, I guess it is, I think partly it is helping, how do parents battle some of their own biases. And I think one of the things is, like, for parents to talk to other parents. I think that's a thing that I don't really ever talk much about, is parents finding kind of support groups for themselves where they can find similar people that are going through similar kind of issues. And so that parents don't feel like they're kind of battling this by themselves. Because I think this can feel like a daunting battle. There's so much bias out there. And I think parents it can feel kind of isolating, like you're swimming upstream. But one of the issues is I think parents should also reach out to other parents and talk more about these and share books and share ideas, and form little support groups to help feel like there's a lot of us that are trying to do this better, and using each other as supports, I think, is part of this. That is not, I think I talk a lot about, but I think is a really important thing to kind of hit home to parents.
Well, as a parent as well, I would welcome that. It is few and far between the instances where that takes place. So I think that's wonderful advice, Christia. How can people connect with you, find the book, all that good stuff? How can point people to where they can go?
Yeah. So they can buy the book. So it's Unraveling Bias. They can buy it anywhere books are sold, right? There's e-copies and audio copies and all of that. You can find that anywhere. And then I'm on Twitter at Christia Brown, and on Instagram at Christia Brown. And then I have a website, christiabrown.com, where they can always email me and things like that too.
I will link all that up so people have one-click access to that in the show description. But thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation, and best of luck to you, okay?
Thanks so much. It was a great conversation.
Many thanks to Dr. Christia Brown for sharing her story on the show this week. Please do me and Christia a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to our conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Christia that I have on the show each and every episode, please subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me. It's michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.